Does evolutionary biology explain life? Does Darwinian evolution have a full explanatory power when it comes to the question how life emerged, what is life, and how life evolved? Usually people answer this question in a binary mode. That is, on one side, people say evolution, Darwinian evolution, is more than sufficient to explain everything that we know about life. And on the other side, there are people who will tell you, no, Darwinian evolution is not sufficient. There might be some form of divine intervention or some cosmic consciousness that directs evolution. Whereas the standard orthodox evolutionary biologist will tell you that evolution is an undirected process and that everything that we know about life can be explained in the frame of the Darwinian mechanisms of evolution, and that we don't need anything more and anything else than that. On the other hand, those who defend some sort of theistic evolution, where there is some sort of divine intervention, usually tend to dismiss completely Darwinian evolution. They tend to embrace some sort of pseudoscientific explanation of how life emerged and how life evolved and functions. The question at this point is there perhaps a third possibility, or are there different ways than this binary mode to understand the evolution of life? Is it possible to accept Darwinian evolution and yet accept also the fact that there is some form of direction and purpose and telos in the evolutionary process? Of course, evolutionary biology posits from the outset that evolution is undirected. And this is the only aspect that we might have to reject. But Darwinian evolution, as it is fine and is perfectly compatible with a view and a paradigm where evolution is directed, has a purpose, and where we can place life inside a teleological paradigm. Moreover, what I'm also trying to point out here is that the idea that Darwinian evolution is a self-sufficient theory that explains away everything about life and evolution is just wild speculation. The idea that natural selection, random mutations, and some other mechanisms, Darwinian mechanisms, explain all what we see around us is just a far-fetched extrapolation, not a scientific fact. First of all, let us see what are the main mechanisms on which the actual theory of Darwinian evolution relies on. Usually, people tend to summarize Darwinian evolution with two ingredients, and that is natural selection and random mutations. Originally, however, as you know, the principles of evolution were defined by Charles Darwin in his famous work On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection. In 1859, he summarized the concept of evolution as natural selection acting on heritable variation within populations. Rephrasing this in a more modern language, we can say that Darwinian evolution is natural selection acting on heritable variation caused by mutations, because nowadays we know that there are also genes that are causing this heritable variation. So natural selection acting on heritable variation caused by mutations, increasing the organism's ability to survive and reproduce, the so-called survival of the fittest. Sometimes people point out that the idea of the survival of the fittest is a sort of logically incoherent expression, because the question is, who is the fittest? Then one could answer, it is the species that survives. So it becomes a sort of logical loop. In reality, there is no problem if you accept the definition that the fittest are those who are able to reproduce better than others, that are able to give more offspring than other species. So it is almost something quantifiable, and there is no contradiction in itself here. One can also ask, what is exactly natural selection? Well, there are many definitions out there. I just take one here of Ridley, who says natural selection is the process by which the forms of organisms in a population that are best adapted, that is, survive and reproduce better, to the environment increase in frequency relative to the less well-adapted forms over a number of generations. Say, for example, that there are green and brown beetles, and the green beetles, however, tend to get eaten by birds more than the brown ones. Therefore, the brown beetles tend to reproduce better in a larger number, and at the end you will find a prevalence of brown beetles, which are therefore selected out by this predatory process from the environment, from other predators, from other animals, and therefore the genetic pool of the brown beetles prevails, and at the end almost all, if not all, green beetles get extinct because of this natural selection process. This is just one of the many examples that one can make to show that natural selection is a real process, exists, is true. Another example that is quite common nowadays is the so-called antibiotic resistance. That is, when microbes evolve mechanisms that protect them from the effects of antibiotic drugs. And after all, natural selection is an obvious fact. Think about how population grows. If we would reproduce without limits, the population would explode exponentially. And very quickly, even the entire planet would be not sufficient to contain all the number of organisms. Of course, it's quite obvious that some selecting mechanism must intervene to stabilize the population. So there are many examples that show that natural selection exists, and there is no reason to doubt it. Another mechanism that rules Darwinian evolution is the genetic drift, more commonly known as the random mutations. That is, there is a genetic variation in the DNA, in our genetic code, that is caused by a lot of phenomena, a lot of mechanisms, a lot of effects from the environment, from the biochemistry of the cell, of the nucleus, and so on, and that cause random mutations in our genetic pool. And even these are then selected out by the same mechanism of natural selection that we discussed previously. It is, however, a common misconception to believe that Darwinian evolution is only summarized and reduced only to these two natural effects and two natural mechanisms of evolution. There are many others as well, such as genetic recombination, gene flow, horizontal gene transfer, epigenetic effects, hybrid speciation, symbiogenesis. With all these Darwinian mechanisms ruled by adaptation, survival and reproduction skills, and don't forget also the environmental factors, so where there are also feedback effects, that is, the species determines also the environment. Not only the environment determines the species, that is, this theory of niche construction, together with some effects given by physics itself, and that lead to the so-called nonlinear self-organization of complex systems. Keep in mind that all these mechanisms are cumulative mechanisms. That is, they build up with time. And don't forget that evolution is a process that is going on now for billions of years. So if something has some complexity, it is also because life had a lot of time to grow into this complexity. Another aspect that we should not forget is that the Darwinian theory of evolution is not unique. There is not 100% agreement among scientists, among evolutionary biologists, what exactly Darwinian evolution theory is about. The more orthodox theory is that of the so-called modern synthesis, and which conceives essentially the kind of mechanisms that we described and was introduced in the 19th century. This remains so far still the basic theory that most biologists embrace. However, there is also a minor but not so negligible community of scientists that ask for an extension of this standard orthodox Darwinian theory, and which is called the extended evolutionary synthesis, or another intellectual current that asks for a similar extension is the so-called third way. And these different interpretations do not disagree on the fact that Darwinian evolution works. However, they place the emphasis on one or more of these mechanisms that I have briefly mentioned here, and that I don't describe in detail, that you can find. It's easy, you can Google it and find what they mean exactly. But my aim here was to give you an idea that Darwinian evolution is something more than just natural selection and random mutations. It's a much more complex theory, and that explains quite well what we can observe nowadays. There is no reason to doubt that these mechanisms are true. I don't enumerate all the evidence and proofs that show how these mechanisms are at work. If you don't believe this, just Google for key phrases such as evidence for evolution or something like that, or search the keywords of the above mentioned Darwinian mechanisms. You will find tons of reliable sources describing why there are very good reasons to conclude that evolution is a real natural process. The real reason why some feel upset with the theory of evolution is not because they find any rational argument to dismiss it, but rather why they themselves believe in the narrative based on the logical fallacies of the evolutionary biologists that jump to conclusions, to metaphysical conclusions. Paradoxically, what evolutionary biologists, I mean the materialists, the physicalist ones, have in common with people that believe in a teleological background in evolution, say, for example, the people of intelligent design or creationists or whoever, they have the same common wrong assumptions regarding, for example, randomness and chance events. There is this common misconception that if we observe random events or phenomena, then these must be, almost per definition, be undirected or unguided. There is, however, no whatsoever reason to believe that. For example, look at this image. It looks pretty random, isn't it? There is no pattern, nothing recognizable, and one would say this is simply a random generated image. However, truth is that this image on the left is an encrypted image of the image on the right, of the flower. So is it random or not? Once you encrypt an image, the image appears completely random. But before the encryption or after the decryption, a meaningful image reappears. That makes perfectly sense. And that you might also say this is a photograph made by someone with an intention and a purpose. There is not something unguided. There's an information with a content and a meaning. So you see that connecting randomness with lack of meaning, lack of information, and lack of any purpose or evidence for an aim is a logical fallacy, a completely unwarranted extrapolation. When the evolutionary biologist says that since mutations are random, therefore evolution is unguided or undirected, then one is making a metaphysical claim. One is no longer speaking of something that is scientific fact, but is speaking about metaphysics, theology, a belief or a lack of belief. It is a sort of subliminal, unaware, unconscious declaration of one's belief in an atheist worldview. Saying that evolution is undirected is a metaphysical claim and has nothing to do with science. But it is presented as such, as a scientific fact, when it is not. And it is this that upsets so many people, because they may eventually not be able to rationalize this, but intimately they feel that there is something wrong with this extrapolation and this jumping to conclusions that are presented as a rational and very reasonable scientific fact when it is not. Another metaphysical claim that one hears frequently from evolutionary biologists is that these aspects of Darwinian evolution, these mechanisms, are more than sufficient to exclude teleology in nature. Teleology means an explanation based on purposefulness, on an aim. A telos comes from the Greek that says nature has an aim, a purpose, a direction, and therefore more or less implicitly hints at a creator, a god, a higher being. So the claim is that the emergence of life, mind and consciousness can be explained by natural selection, random mutations, and so on and so on. And voila, life in all its complexity and splendor came into being. This, however, is not only a metaphysical statement. It is not only a belief that we would like to be true, but is also an assumption that is light years away from having been shown to be true. This idea that everything can be explained by natural selection and few random mutations is in reality an extraordinary stretch of imagination, a wild speculation, a wild fantasy that has no scientific basis and no evidence that supports it. It is only a typical habit of the human mind, which, once it discovers few elementary truths, tends to generalize it to everything that it knows, believing that these few elementary and a bit primitive principles explain away everything, and then presents it as a scientific truth because the single principles have been proven, but certainly not that these are self-sufficient to explain evolution. The question whether evolution is a directed or undirected process remains an open question more than ever.